Before we can teach students to analyze the language and logic of texts, making meaning from the words, images, sounds, and movements that an author uses, we have to have a framework from which to analyze these texts. The framework that we're going to use is one of coherence, the stuff that makes a text, or how the text is structured. To understand coherence, let's think about a conversation that you might have with 3 of your friends. This is you, by the way. At any given time in one conversation, so you and your 3 friends are talking, there might be 2 conversations going on, especially as you and your friends switch topics. If I typed out the full chronological conversation, we might see that although it was one speech act, one conversation, there are actually 2 different texts there. One, let's say, about the best football team in the league, and one about concussions in the NFL, for example. Coherent structures enable us to make sense of the relationships within a text, alerting us to the idea that what is said earlier has a relationship to what is being said now. There are 4 coherence relationships that we might be interested in any given text. The first is temporality, or you might say time and sequence. Temporality can be expressed with lexical cues. Another way of saying that is specific words in a text, like then or next. A second type of coherence is causation. The lexical cues that are used here might be because, so, thus. A third type of coherence that we find in text is compare-contrast. Now, compare and contrast uses some lexical cues that are just single words like unlike or like, but they also have a lot of noun phrases. For example, similar to and in contrast. The fourth coherent structure that we want to take a look at, and it's usually pretty helpful, especially when we talk about disciplinary literacy, is something called enumeration. Now, enumeration is a little bit different from these other 3 types of coherence. So we're going to put a dotted line here. It's certainly a coherent structure, but it's more on a macro level. It's more on a paragraph level rather than a sentence level. And for enumeration, we don't have necessary lexical cues, but we have 2 definite structures. The first structure is called deductive enumeration, where an author presents a theme, and that is followed by a list of characteristics on that theme. So for example, I started off with this theme of coherence here, and now I'm providing you a list, so I'm using deductive enumeration. And you guess it, the second one is inductive enumeration. And that's just the exact opposite, starting with a list of characteristics and moving to a theme. Most students understand these coherence types via their own language use and reading instruction. What is interesting is that different disciplines use these types to varying degree in varying texts. To further complicate the matter, an author might imply any of these coherent structures without using the lexical cues that we just talked about. For example, let's use temporality for an example. I might write something like, Jason went to the bank. He went to the store. He bought groceries. It's not great English, but temporality is obviously implied here. I could have also written, Jason ate ice cream. He felt sad. Here, causality is implied, although it's not really obvious if Jason is sad because he ate the ice cream or vice versa. Either way, the author puts the onus on the reader to make meanings when any of these are implied, when those lexical cues aren't present in the text. All of these examples have been on the micro level of the text, meaning that the level is at the individual sentences, except for enumeration, which we just talked about, which is at the paragraph level. Again, that's pretty macro or micro in its structure. We could also think about these coherence levels in a macro structure and then within text or across text. A great way to think about this is if we invert a triangle and divide it into 3 sections. This first section here would be the micro level, those within sentence, within paragraph coherent structures. As students get deeper, and this is in their understanding, we can start taking a look at how these coherent structures are facilitated in the macro level of the text. So when I take a look at a history textbook, let's say, and it uses temporality and causation to talk about the causes and the events leading up to the American Revolution. Well, that might be in, let's say, Chapter 2. In Chapter 3, we're going to talk about some similar things with the War of 1812. And those same themes, the events are changed, but the same themes that were talked about with the temporality and the causation lead to, from what's going on in the American Revolution to what's happening in the War of 1812. Another great way to think about this is for a math textbook or a science textbook, where some of the basic skills right at the beginning really, let's talk about compare and contrast when we talk about different geologic formations. Some of those same themes, once you understand those basics, they are built upon in later chapters. So there's a coherence there with the temporality, causation, and compare and contrast. When students get really sophisticated with this, we can take a look across texts. When this happens, students are able to really create their own meaning in really academic and really higher order ways. When developing your own text-based discussions, make sure that you develop questions and tasks that encourage students to see not just the details at the heart of the text, but also the coherence relationships that enable them to explain the meanings behind those details.